Beginning. Sometimes this is something that I forget to do. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is block 2 of our third day of sessions here at the 7th Annual University of Maryland Environmental Justice Symposium. My name is Jan Michael Archer. I'm a doctoral student working here at the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. I am joined by Sandra Olek, and Sandy, I'll let you introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandy Olek with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I'm with the Chesapeake and Coastal Service, and I'm a senior policy advisor on our coastal program and climate team.
Excellent. And what we are going to talk to you about today is a tool that we've collaborated on. Sandy got it going, what is it, 12 years ago? Yeah. Something like that. And I picked it up a few years ago when I started my program here at Maryland. So this presentation, this session is going to have about, well, 2 major parts. One is going to, well, three parts. An introduction to this tool, this Maryland Park Equity Mapping tool that we have developed, and then a demonstration of the tool, and then a side project that was kind of a spin-off of the tool to work. Once we started developing the tool, we found that, there's some data that we don't have. Let's collect it. So we did a survey, and I'll go through some of the results, the preliminary results from that pilot survey. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Scroll to the top, and we'll get started. Okay, so the title of this session is "And Justice for All: Park Equity, Green Space Access for All." The Park Equity Mapper is a GIS tool, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about what that means here now. But first, let's talk about, let's start on the ground floor here. When we're talking about parks and we're talking about green space, what is it? What's a park? What is green space? There are lots of definitions. Especially when we get into policy, different states, different municipalities have their own definitions of what a park is and what green space is. But for the sake of framing this talk and this session, it suffices to say that parks come in all different shapes and sizes, and a host of different amenities, right? So across, all these images that I have here, you've got you've got a playground here. This might be a city or like a pocket park, or maybe even a apartment complex playground area, which can be a park. You've also got some expansive wilderness, lake areas, wildlife refuges, co-moderators or co-mentor monitors. Please, as you join the session, please make sure you're muted. And if you're not muted, Denise and Michaela will mute you. But yeah, so you've got wildlife refuge areas, you've got what's called pristine wilderness, and then you've also got recreation parks, which sometimes are just a basketball court or a tennis court or a pavilion with some picnic tables. So park is not sufficiently the same thing as green space, but parks in and of themselves as a place for recreation do provide a lot of health and benefit. But what we want to drill down on is specifically the benefits that come from green space at parks. And so that's kind of the framing. As I move forward, I might say parks, but I'm specifically talking about those green parks. And so now that we've talked about parks, what about equity? What does equity mean? A kind of workhorse definition that suffices for this is equity is the quality of 1, being fair and impartial, 2, providing access, opportunity, and advancement for all, and then 3, identifying and eliminating barriers to that access and barriers to that participation. So you can think of it as equal access to opportunities and resources for all members of society. And just to kind of drill that home, I've got a little graphic here that some of you might be, it's kind of a meme now. I've seen it all over the internet. But this is breaking down the difference between equality, equity, and justice. So we have a ball game here, and we've got 3 folks that want to watch this ball game. There's a barrier, and that's the fence. And you can see this barrier across all 3 images here. Now, the solution when we're thinking about equality is to apply the same fix to everyone. Everyone gets the same size box. And as you can see, that still creates a barrier because we as people and as communities are not all created equal, and we have different needs. So an equality fix is not always the best fix when we're trying to reduce those barriers. Now, when we're talking about equity, equity means applying the fix that's commensurate, or a fix that fits the need. So this dude over here doesn't really need any sort of accommodation, and so he's not given any, and he's able to see the game just fine. The dude in the middle needs some accommodation, and he's given as much as is needed. And the dude here all the way on the right, who is in need of most accommodation, gets what he needs. And what equity does is it brings us closer to justice now. Justice, of course, is the ideal or the goal where you're reducing the barrier altogether. And the semantically, there's still a fence here. There's still a barrier, and there's maybe a metaphor there about there always being better barriers. But everyone has equal access to viewing the game, and so that's the justice. That's what we're seeking, and equity helps us get there. And so when we bring it all together, park equity means creating equal access to opportunities in parks and other green spaces for all. And when we're talking about that in Maryland, we're talking about for all Marylanders. And what are those opportunities that I'm talking about? It's kind of abstract. So let's put a little bit more, a little more framing around it and give it some more teeth. Specifically with this project, we used a document called the Land Preservation and Recreation Plan, or the LPRP. And what this plan does is it sets out first of all, it lists all of the park spaces managed by the state, or managed throughout the state. And it has these opportunities listed in terms of what it breaks down these amenities provided by these park spaces. And so there are 6 major ones: water recreation, natural areas, picnicking, trails, hunting, and fishing. And so these are the different ways in which people utilize parks in the state of Maryland. That's definitely not an exhaustive list, but these are the main ways. And and even if this might not be the main reason that they're going to these parks, maybe intuitively or maybe inherently people are aware of, but there's some really significant health benefits with having access to park space, to green space. And from a public health perspective, we break it down 3 ways. We talk about instauration, which is encouraging physical activity and social unity. Okay, that's getting the blood going, getting exercise. And then restoration has more to do with mental, not mental activity, but mental wholeness and mental health. And it allows you to direct and restore your attention and your focus. There are several studies that have elucidated or illustrated the effect of just listening to birds, listening to the wind, listening to flowing water, and what that does for reducing your cortisol levels, reducing your stress hormones. And so that's restoration. And then mitigation, which, this is an environmental justice and an environmental conference. I'm sure many people are familiar with this benefit of green space as an opportunity to take up harmful pollutants, provide soil stabilization, provide sinks for collecting toxins in areas, and providing habitat as well. So reducing your toxic exposures and toxic stressors are another service that's provided by having green space in your community. And all of it leads to the better health and well-being of our communities and of society. Just to kind of beat it a little harder, we also see societal benefits from economic, housing and business values go up when there's more green space. I talked a little bit about the ecological impacts, but stormwater mitigation, heat mitigation. There was a great session on heat earlier in the week. Just a small plug, you'll be able to view all of the recordings from this conference on YouTube in a week or two. And then sociologic, and there's an asterisk here with crime. We do see reduced crime in areas with more green space, but the green space has to be well maintained and well invested in. Okay, if you have a kind of decrepit park, which with that's overgrown and the lights are broken, then those can sometimes become a source of, or maybe not a source, but a refuge for illicit activities. So it's not enough to just have the park there. It has to be maintained and invested in, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So now bringing it to the tool that we've developed here. As I mentioned, Sandy started working on this thing 13 years ago. I'm seeing the number now, 2008, with the Maryland Partnership for Children in Nature. And in 2015 and 2016, there was an update to specifically drill down on Prince George's County here in Maryland, to look for park poor, under canopied areas with respect to our populations of older adults, senior citizens, and minors, folks younger than 18. And it also brought the scale down from being at the census tract level to the census block group level. And what that allows you to do is kind of make closer or more relevant community assumptions, because you're not looking at, say for instance, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with these terms, census block group, census tract, most people know what a zip code is. So a zip code is a way of kind of setting a boundary around a place and attaching an identifier to it. And it's the same thing with census tracts, which are a little bit smaller than zip codes. And then census block groups are smaller still. So you're getting down to that community level with the block group analysis. And so we expanded on the Maryland Park Equity Tool. And when I say we, I mean Dr. Jacoby Wilson and myself here at the University of Maryland, also the Center for Geospatial Information Science at the University of Maryland. And we developed we added more layering to the tool, because initially when identifying park equity, the emphasis was on distance to a park. And not just distance to a park. The main indicators of equity and availability of parks was their distance, the population density in an area, the income in an area, age, and then the racial and ethnic makeup of an area. And when Sandy came to us and said, hey, we want to improve this tool, we hit the literature and we said, okay, this is just the starting line for barriers to access. We're talking about equity, we're talking about barriers to access. So it's not just the distance. You could have a park right across the street, but if that street is a 6-lane highway, you don't have access to it. So things going into transportation, public transportation, walkability, these are layers that we added to the tool to come up with this final kind of tweaked, revised model that you see here on the left, where you still have a good amount of weight placed behind park distance, because it is a big factor of whether or not there is a park to be accessed. And then again, this is an environmental justice conference. So folks in the audience, I'm sure, are aware of, the connection that race and ethnicity over 400 years of disenfranchisement, just speaking about African Americans, not talking about Native Americans, Indigenous peoples, Latinx, Hispanic folks. You cannot take race and ethnicity out of the equation here. And then from there, we added in the rest of the factors being equal. And so what this allows us to do, is my slide moving? Okay, there we go. So ultimately, what does this tool do? What do we want it for? You can explore layers of green space access and concern. And when I talk about layers, I mean those different indicators that I just showed. You can compare the scores of different areas and see which, either at the county level or at the census block group level, which areas, which communities have better access than others. And you can also view additional context layers relevant to some specific concerns. For instance, the proximity to animal agriculture, industrial animal agriculture. So who do we want to, so that's what you can do with the tool, but who do we want to be using this tool? We want regulators using this tool to identify areas of park need and then invest in those areas. And we want residents to use the tool as a way to document their lived experiences. And I'll go into a little bit more on that when we get into the demonstration, which I can either go straight to, let's see, do I want to go straight to it? I have a few more slides on this deck, and I think Yeah, so I can make these slides available. This kind of goes into, what are our data sources, and that's all good information to have, and I'm happy to provide it, as well as a little bit more instruction on how to use. But I'll go through all of this in the demonstration. I put this slide here in the middle because I always forget at the end or I run out of time. I definitely have to, acknowledge the partners that have worked on this tool. In addition to the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and Sandy's team, the National Center for Smart Growth here at the University of Maryland, and also the Center for Geospatial Information Science here at Maryland. And as Sandy mentioned, through I think Sandy mentioned, this whole work is funded out of a parent grant from NOAA. And so we're really happy to be doing this work and really happy that NOAA is investing in this work. So with that, before as I transition over, I want to give Sandy the floor to talk about, I talked about regulators using this tool. So I'd love for Sandy to take a few minutes and talk about how the Maryland Department of Natural Resources is using the tool.
Thank you, Jan. So while he's loading it, let me just give a little bit of background on who we are from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, because I think that provides some context. So we are funders of park space, funders of restoration projects. We maintain our own spaces. We have state parks. So we're looking at where we're locating parks, how we're maintaining parks, amenities in our parks. And we have other resources, whether it be tree planting dollars or environmental education and such. But I think there's also the opportunity. And so I'm in the coastal zone that works with local partners, and we provide technical assistance on long range planning. And so that's where we think some of these tools can really be used at an intervention when you're doing these, Yan showed the state LPRP, which is a 5-year plan. And it's a great incentive because the locals, meaning the 23, 24 counties, we count the city as a county, but the state, then have to do their 5-year plan in order to be eligible for certain federal dollars. So there's all kinds of leverage that we can use. And I think for the first time too, we do a plan, then they do a plan, and then they build upon each other. And we usually like to take local feedback in for our plan and our priorities. And so we just started probably when this was done, 10 years ago, said, as you do your 5-year plan, we'd really like for you to take equity into consideration. So that's where this tool came into play. We no longer say we'd like for you to do it. We require the locals to take a look at equity when they are mapping out their acreages of parks, where their parks are located, and what amenities are available. That said, as Yan gets ready to launch the actual mapper, we try and build a mapper using the data that the locals then turn into the state. So there's always, we're not trying to say, this is what's happening on the ground without the real data that's ground truth and coming from the locals themselves. We've used this tool and evolved it, and I think Yan's probably going to give a little mention of tying it in with the Maryland EJ score, the climate and health equity mapper, and we are still figuring out all the ways in which it can be used as we discuss climate. And Yan mentioned, the parks that are providing heat, addressing heat, urban heat island issues, or canopy cover, or access for just that recharging, the health benefits that come with it. So we are able to dive down and take a look at when the state is funding revitalization projects, and we're looking at, affordable housing or transit projects or things like that. We can then also take a look at not just the building envelope, but what's beyond that, and what park amenities are in the area and what the needs are, and really provide it to locals to actually make the case for funding and resource allocation. So we're just, I think, at the tip of the iceberg of how we can use this. I would say we're doing, our own soul searching at DNR and taking a look at how we've been allocating our resources and doing this analysis using tools like this. So I'm sure we'll jump into a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I want to add, just to kind of toot your horn, Sandy, is you've been kind of a tenacious proponent of using this tool to the point where the secretary of the department is also advocating for the use of this tool. So that's a model for other states. I'm seeing in the chat we've got folks, Dawood Shabaka from Savannah, Georgia, and others coming from different states. This is definitely a model, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the day. We have another session on these mapping tools, where I'll probably talk a little bit more about the Maryland EJ screen tool in that session, versus this one. But there's a lot of opportunity, and states and communities are hungry for this resource to actually visualize what's happening in the communities, and report what's happening.
One thing that we really didn't anticipate with the pandemic is parks became a lifeblood for communities, for businesses, for public gatherings. We've been working with national groups like Green Schoolyards America on how schools can use parks to safely reopen schools, and not everyone has access to those nearby nature, nearby park spaces. So at the same time, as I said, we have our state parks. Our park usage has tripled. We have so many days when we literally have to close our gates because of limited for parking. We're limited for parking in Patapsco Valley State Park and Sandy Point, and places that are probably closest to Central Maryland and some of our urban areas. And so we realize we're going to need more space, and this is a tool that can help guide us with that.
Absolutely. So just a note on accessing the tool. So this is the link. I'll put it in the chat. It will take you to a DNR webpage, and from there you can learn about the different nuances and background on the tool. And you can also click on this button which says interact with this map. So I'll click on that now. And the first thing you see when you open the tool is this splash screen that gives you a little bit of orientation and background. It talks about the different layers that you'll be looking at and what the colors mean as they're laid out. And it also gives a link to the user guide, which you can find in another space on the tool I'll talk about, for more information on using the tool. But let's dig in here. So this is the Maryland Park Equity Mapper. And we'll go from left to right here, because I found that that's kind of the best way to talk about all the this thing is jam-packed with features. And so a systematic way is to kind of go from left to right. So up here in the top left corner, you'll see an address bar where you can take you can take an address. I can go to the University of Maryland, and it should populate University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm at College Park, but let's check out Baltimore County, and then it zooms you straight there. Additionally, so that's if you're trying to find an area that you're not currently located at. If I want to find where I am directly, there's an even easier way to do that by clicking on this little crosshair button, and it takes me straight to my location here in beautiful Greenbelt, Maryland. And so as we're here in Greenbelt, Maryland, let's take a look at what's going on. First and foremost, we see a range of different colors, shades, I'll say, here on the screen. So what do those shades mean? If I open up this legend here, it'll pop out a box and it'll show me that the lighter the color, the higher the park equity, and the darker the color, the lower the park equity. So let's zoom in here and see, okay, I live in close to what's called Old Greenbelt, which was developed in the 1930s. It's a fairly affluent part of town. I live just, I mean, not to not to brag or anything. I live in an apartment complex and I'm paying for it. but this, the rest of Greenbelt over here, Old Greenbelt, is pretty affluent. And so you see that connection between, and we'll go into the layer of income, but you can see that this area around here has very high park equity because indicated by this light color. And that's really interesting because we are right next to a highway here. We're right next to 295. By contrast, if I go over here to Spring Hill Lake, which is on the other side of Kenilworth Avenue, I see a much darker color indicating lower equity, lower access to park space. And you don't really just right off the bat, you don't have to take the map's word for it. You can actually flip on, click on these 4 squares. It gives you a base map gallery, and I can look at satellite imagery. And just for a second, if I turn this off, you can see, just from this aerial image, you can see much more trees, much more tree cover, much more green space over here compared to this very densely, there's a huge apartment complex over here, and this much more densely populated area across Kenilworth there. So flipping that back on and flipping us back over to the original map that we were looking at here, or I think it was actually the street map. There we go. And so that's the legend. That's how we orient kind of what are we looking at? What do the dark color means? What do the light colors mean? Next, we can go over to this select tool. And the select tool is really cool. And it's different from a lot of other EJ mappers because it dynamically generates, based on what you're selecting, based on what you're focusing on, it'll show you what the situation is in that area. And I forget, but sometimes I have to beef up my screen size there just to show that. But so I've clicked on this area here. This is the whole census block group that in which I live. And so you can see that the population density score here, if I hover over it, it gives me a 0.2. So we'll call that 20. So it gives us a population density score of 20. And that's a little bit higher than the county score, which is 14. And it's just barely higher than the state score, which is 19. And how do I know that that's the county and the state? Down here, there's a legend. The blue is what I've selected. The red is the county. And then the state is in black here, okay? So there's actually a pretty high low wealth score. And what does that low wealth score mean? This is the population of folks who are living within 185% of the poverty level. And so that also tracks for me. The reason I choose Greenbelt here is because I am a resident and I can tell you what's going on the ground. So that actually tracks pretty well because there's in this ring of this area, there's actually a pretty high, there's my apartment complex and there's a couple other apartment complexes here in the area. And you can see that that's higher than the county 45 and the state 46. We're sitting at 67. And you can go through the whole line. You can see that, youth, there are more youth in this census block group compared to the median for the county and the state. Fewer older adults in this area than the median and than the state and the county. And one thing to note here is the non-white score, the people of color score, being lower here than the county. Prince George's County is known for being not only a fairly affluent community, but a fairly affluent Black county. I shouldn't say community, county. And so the percentage of people of color here in Greenbelt, in my specific block group of Greenbelt, is lower than in the rest of the county. And so you can do that. I can click on anywhere on this map, anywhere in the state of Maryland, and it will show me these same dynamics, what's going on in different places. And I'll open it up to the audience in a little bit here to call out some spots, or you can drop it in the chat and we can go, on a little scavenger hunt and see what's going on in different areas. And so that's the select tool. The select tool also gives us an opportunity to look at these things in terms of the spread. So when we're thinking about data, you don't want to just look at one data point. You want to look at a spread of data points or a series of data points and see what's going on between them. And so that's what this advanced statistics tab allows us to do. I can compare the area that I've selected to the rest of the county and see, okay, if I go back to Greenbelt here, and I click on my area, not a whole lot of spread here. And that also has to do with me only clicking on a single spot. So if I want to get all of Greenbelt in here, I'll highlight the select box And well, first I'll highlight that select box and then draw a circle just for if I want to get this old greenbelt area. And now I see kind of, okay, again, there's not much of a spread going on here, but you can see there's definitely a large spread when we're talking about population density, a pretty large spread throughout the county. Prince George's County has tons of rural area of less densely populated area, and then comparing that to the state as well. And again, you can look at those comparisons across every single indicator. And then finally, with this little select box, I can hit the report tool. And what that does is it outputs a PDF. I can name it. I can say old greenbelt, if I can type it. And this little loading bar is loading up the map that we were just looking at. It's got my chart in here. It's got the statistics broken out. And I can take that and I can add that to a grant application. And, or, if I work as one of these park managers, I can take this out and say, okay, Sandy, here's the park equity report. I ran the numbers and this is what we got. It's also an opportunity to use the print tool to just print the map by itself, if you'd like to do that. And there's also this side-by-side map viewer tool, which allows us to look at the layers kind of together, but not necessarily stacked on top of each other. And so an example of why I might want to do that is, say I want to look at population, the non-white population in Maryland versus the distance, or let's say, excuse me, versus the low wealth score. Okay, so what this is showing me is that the darker the color, the higher percentage of non-white folks in the area, in the state. Okay, so you see some pockets on the Eastern Shore. You see a big signal here in Prince George's County, in Baltimore as well. Okay, and now if I want to zoom in, for instance, so say I want to zoom in on this pocket here on the Eastern Shore, I can look at that there. And I can see now that not only does Princess Anne have a high population of people of color, but also a high population of people within that 185% of the poverty level, overlapping there, right by the UMES. And so that's another tool, another way of looking at the data using the Park Equity Mapper there. So those are all the features and functions and built into the tool. And so now what I want to do is go over to the right-hand side of the tool and talk about the actual data that we're looking at and that we're using these functions for. So first and foremost, we have this park equity score, and that's that aggregate score, that combined score of those layers that I talked about. And we'll go through the layers individually in a little bit. But this, so I can turn that off and this map goes away. It just becomes a blank street map of the state. But I can also turn on this parks layer. Oh, I gotta turn that on. There we go. So I can turn on this parks layer and it shows me every park that's listed in the LPRP document that the Maryland Department of Natural Resources has registered as being a park. And we've broken these parks out in terms of being people-powered and nature-based, or just nature-based. And so let me get into that a little bit. When we're talking about people-powered parks, we're thinking about those amenities that have to do that don't necessarily indicate they're useful and valuable for recreation and public health. When we're talking about exercise, things like ball fields, picnic areas, and things like that. But they're kind of divorced from your nature-based recreation, which has more to do with, okay, is this a wildlife natural area? Is this somewhere where you can hunt, where you can fish? And we thought we found it relevant to make a distinction and not just show where are the different parks, because like I said at the beginning, parks have a lot of different definitions. We found it relevant to say not just where are the parks in the state, but what are the services provided by these parks? And so that's what this parks layer does with this people-powered, nature-based recreation does. And there's also the amenities here. And the amenities is just kind of a count 0 to 3 amenities, 4 to 7 amenities, 8 to 11 amenities. And those amenities are listed, if I click on any of these dots, they're listed in terms of what I talked about. Those trail, is there a trail there? Yes, 1 point. Is there natural areas? Another point. Hunting? No, don't add a point. Don't add a point for fishing. Don't add a point for picnicking, water recreation, and so on and so forth. And so this is another thing that gives us more information of not just where are the parks, but what level of services are being provided at the parks throughout the state. And this is something that is definitely kind of a work in progress, working with the counties, working with the municipalities, because we've found that these data are not uniformly collected in, all in the same place or all in the same way. So we've had Prince George's County, upon developing and deploying this tool out in the wild and telling folks to use it and test it, we've had folks come back and say, okay, you missed a bunch of parks in Prince George's County. And we said, okay, send us the data. And they did. We're going through the same process in Baltimore County and Howard County right now, trying to get a more updated data set, because we're finding that, I think it's really interesting, because what it's done is it's pushed people to make sure that this data is available and viewable and accessible to the public in a way that it hasn't been before. Because now we have a tool up and we're saying, okay, this tool is making y'all look real bad. And they're like, oh no, you got it wrong. And I mean, we're happy to get it wrong. You got to fix it though. You got to give us the data to fix it.
Can I interject one thing too?
Absolutely.
When we talk about parks, we're talking about publicly managed parks. So it's a challenge because there's a lot of green space. So we're talking about, there's a difference between local, adopt a lot or a green space that the community has to manage. And Yan really talked about the health benefits from a managed and well-operated green space versus one that may not be maintained. But that made me think, when you were talking about Baltimore County, we also have some counties that really work hand in hand, and they have shared use agreements with their schools, and they may be using parks or ball fields from their schools. But that's a conversation that's kind of ongoing too, because they may count it for recreation purposes, but it's not a park that someone could go to in the middle of the day, often because the school is in session, or they may not have community access after hours. So every county is unique, and we're really trying to work with them and how we count the parks and how they count the parks.
Absolutely. And so those are some, just adds a little bit more context to what we're looking at here. This is that park equity score that I was going through earlier. And now to break down specifically what are our layers showing, we've got so population density score, households within 185% of the poverty line, concentration of children under the age of 18, concentration of adults over the age of 64, concentration of people of color, distance to a park. Let me flick that on. This is one's going to take a little bit to load. There it is. Distance to a park, distance to public transportation. Lighter color meaning, high access to public transportation, which, just eyeballing this makes a lot of sense over there. Walkability. And then linguistic isolation. And so these are all the layers that are combined, and they're not equally weighted. As I mentioned, the model is actually on the Maryland DNR website, but there's emphasis placed on distance to a park and population of color, because we've seen through previous surveys and previous research, lower equity and lower access for non-white populations, for people of color, for BIPOC communities, when it comes to having this green space access, on top of the systemic oppression and other disenfranchisement and under-resourcing that we see in those same communities. Finally, we have our context layers, and these are just added context on a range of different topics. So I'll go through these quickly. If you in the audience see one that you want me to drill down on, I'd be happy to. As an experiment, we tried to implement COVID versus this park equity layers that we had. But this is not a dashboard tool. It's not updated every second, every 24 hours. It's often updated kind of in an ad hoc way. And so we found very quickly that having that COVID layer there is not very meaningful. And so this is one that will be coming off of the tool. But it's an important factor, again, for these intersecting, disparities. It's important to know where your COVID cases are versus your park equity. So we're looking for a way to kind of be more dynamic in adding that in the future. But we're not there yet. And I'm happy, well, maybe not happy to say, but I'm willingly will say that we're not there yet. We have the Gini index, which is an index of income or wealth segregation. Okay, so you can look at that in context with where parks are. You can frame different boundaries, different zip codes, municipalities, different counties, different legislative districts. This is an interesting one. So if you are a community member on the ground and you want to know, okay, who do I go to fix these issues? Who can I lean on, or who can I call on? Because we shouldn't have to lean on our representative officials. We should have to just call on them. And you can say like, okay, I'm in this, this could be much better implemented. I don't know why it's giving me all this all the background data. It should just tell you the code. So that's an issue on our end. But this is legislative district number 20. And so knowing that district and then also knowing the name of who that representative is gives you an opportunity to call on for redress of that issue. Supermarkets, small grocery stores, public schools, existing parks as kind of, this is a green space layer kind of existing as a polygon shapefile. So not the points that we had before, but the polygon. So you can actually get an idea of, the point only tells you, one point of that park. This one shows you where does it stretch, where does it go. Urban heat island data that's been mapped and tracked. Public transportation, railroads, combined sewer outfalls, wastewater treatment plants, landfills, toxic, I'm blanking, it's late in the day, TRI, toxic release inventory facilities, sorry about that, power plants, Superfund sites, meatpacking plants, and concentrated animal feeding operations. Now you might say, oh yeah, and you flipped on this layer and it didn't really do anything. Well, let's look over here on the Eastern Shore. So this is one of those issues that is very relevant to just almost 1/3 or 1/4 of the state. And we're talking about this industrial animal agriculture. And one thing that we're looking to do with our Maryland environmental justice screening tool is implement this layer as proximity. We have proximity to toxic facilities by other names, but in a lot of ways, these AFOs, these animal feeding operations, are not listed as toxic facilities. And so we want to specifically map, okay, how does your proximity to these areas influence your environmental health hazard or environmental justice score. Healthcare shortage areas in the state. You can see huge shortage areas on the Eastern Shore there. And then some more socioeconomic data, 200% of the federal poverty level, to go a little bit further than just the 185 standard from the census. USDA low income, low access to food, percent Hispanic and Black, income inequality. So that's the full range of the context layers that we have up to this point. We might add more in the future. And that's really the whole tool. I can take a minute. So let's see, it's 1:45 now. The session gets out at 2:10. I still want to go over some survey results. So I can take maybe 5 minutes here and just open the floor up for some questions while they're fresh and while I have the mapper up on the screen. And then maybe we could do more questions at the very end. But if there's anyone, room monitors, I will ask that you help me out here. We can see if folks have their hands raised, or if you know how to raise your hand in the chat, you can raise your hand and ask a question.
And I'll just jump in with something while we're waiting to see if we have questions. But this is one of the applications that the possibilities are just endless. But when we talk about greening of schoolyards and access for children to parks and environmental literacy enhancements, looking at park equity and then the location of schools is something that's critically important. And even when you hear about doctors writing prescriptions to go outside to a park and park RX programs and like that, it's really amazing to be able to look at the health outcomes overlaid with park locations, park equity. We have a request for looking at transit access to Watkins Glen Park.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that park per se. Watkins Glen, or no, that's New York. Is that in the chat? Let's see.
Okay,
oh,
so
it is Watkins Glen.
I always confuse Watkins Glen. There's one in Prince George's and one in Wheaton, but I always confuse the two.
Where do you want us to go, Bill Orleans? Well, actually, I can just pull it up on Google. Watkins Glen, Maryland. So I've got Watkins Regional Park.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So I'll drop this.
I will say my parents took me to both parks as a child, so I just wasn't driving.
My excuse is that I grew up in Georgia. So here we are at Watkins Regional Park in Kettering. And so right off the bat, we can open up our legend and see that this kind of aligns here with I'm also pretty bad with colors. In the, in maybe the middle tier or the second highest tier here. And so if you're interested specifically, I think the question was about transit equity. We can flip on distance to public transportation. And so what I can do, actually the best way to do this would be to compare in the side by side. So we've got our overall total score here. And now let's compare that to just public transportation distance. And Watkins, so now of course we lose kind of where Watkins Glen is. Kettering. Landover, that's what, 45?
Yeah, I think if you
that's
type
45.
Watkins Regional Park.
Gotcha. Well, unfortunately, in the side-by-side mapper, there isn't a search bar, but so 495 is here. And let's see, am I in the area? Am I in the right area here? At any rate, a lot of this area, it's showing very low scores for public transit distance. And a low score means you have more distance there. And so that's the takeaway in from that respect. We can go back over to this side of the map and look at it in a little bit more detail. If I turn on the map here.
They're looking at kind of around 202 and 193, if that helps at all.
So I got 193 and I got 50. But basically that's what we're seeing. And this kind of gets into the question, or not the question, well, one of the questions that I asked through developing this tool is getting community feedback and saying, okay, is this what you expected to see for Watkins Regional Park with regards to transit equity, or if we're not looking specifically at transit equity, if we want to look at the full picture of access, search there. It's getting a little upset with me.
I'm not upset, Dan.
Oh no, I was saying the computer is, but thanks.
That was precisely the point. I know there's a fairly prominent Prince George's organization that's planning on a September picnic, if God willing, and then Panda willing. And the discussion has been how are people to get to the picnic if they don't drive? Access by automobile is very good. But there's a Metro bus that goes out 450. It's about a 3/4 to a mile walk. Occasionally there's a bus on 202, but that's also necessitates quite a hike. And it's a park and planning facility. It would seem to me that park and planning and Prince George's County Department of Public Works and Transportation should have an understanding, at least on occasions when the park is utilized for a larger activity, that transit be made available. And drivers that they can assign for special purposes, and where there's no existing fixed route, and better use of the parks, more equitable use of the parks as well. I'm sorry to tangent, but I was just curious.
No, absolutely, and your
how
point.
your internet skills could demonstrate.
Thanks.
Oh, my point is that it's very tough to get there without driving.
Yeah,
was my point.
absolutely.
There is no transit access.
Yeah, so because there was also a question from Richard Allen. Hi, Richard, in the chat about joint projects with MDOT, MT, Maryland Transit Authority, Department of Transportation. And that is why we have walkability and transit access as part of the score here. And we have been coordinating with Maryland Department of Transportation, who also has put out a map. It is not a model and not really built into the same mechanism and platform that the other mappers are on, that Yan, I think, was going to show. But they do have a location of parks across the state that we've provided the similar data, and then how to get there by walk, bike, and transit. And I think that's where the policy opportunities start to really kind of pop up, is, okay, here's a very large park. Who is it serving if it's only drivable? And how do we improve access?
Right, and indeed, you can see actually, Maryland as a whole, and looking at things from the state level now is that's where you kind of lose any kind of power to make these associations, because across the whole state, you'd probably be hard pressed to find a very walkable or public transit friendly state. But at least for Prince George's County, the score, I can't even get it to trigger here because the score is 1. And then for this area, it's 1 as well. So that those are areas, just like Sandy says, these are opportunities, and what the tool allows us to do now is put that up front and center and say, rather than just providing a data sheet or some tables, looking at it on a map and saying, like, okay, this is, and especially with regards, we're talking about barriers to access to green space. So I couldn't have planted a better a better question there, Bill. So thank you. And I see that you've got your hand up. We'll do you, and then I'll go through my survey results pretty quickly.
Okay. Hi, Yan. Hi, Sandy. I'm Ann Strozik, and I'm a teacher in Howard County. And we are in the process of implementing a very exciting climate change grant across our entire 6th grade. And I am studying both tools, the Park Equity Map and the Maryland EJ score, trying to figure out exactly what to hone in on. But my question is more of a I guess, how do you manage when working with students when they're looking at a county and they see one part of the county is more affluent than another? And how do you kind of manage those reactions to potential inequities?
Ooh.
I know maybe that's a big question.
What is critical race theory? So there's a lot of opportunities, and especially when we're talking about middle schoolers, right? Where you're forming, where you're at the kind of developmental maturity to think about things like inequity and about, you know, systemic levers and oppression and things like that. I think it's an opportunity not only to study the problem or look at it from miles away, but actually to go there and engage with community, find community organizations that can, you know, community voices. One of the main themes of this conference from year to year is having community members speak for themselves. And that's something that these tools, if you're not careful, can get you away from, because they are such powerful tools. They give you a lot of data, but this tool is by no means a substitute for a community voice, you know, to speak what they are experiencing, what their lived experience is, you know, with regards to whether it's green space or pollution or, you know, any number of things, any number of the topics that we talk about at this conference. And so when you use the tool here and you see, for instance, if we're looking at Howard County and we see Columbia having less access and equity to green space, you can talk about what that does in the present in terms of opportunities for children or students to go out and play today. You can talk about redlining and how it got that way. You can talk about in the future of climate impacts and in a lot of ways the present climate impacts with regards to shade and urban heat islands. So I think there's a whole wealth of opportunities to use not only this tool, but environmental justice as a base for digging into, you know, climate, history, culture, all kinds of stuff. I don't know if that answers your question very deeply, and it's kind of a broad answer, but I hope it was helpful maybe. And I'm always available. I'll put my information in the chat. I love talking about these things, so reach out.
Likewise, Anne, I'm from Howard County and pretty familiar with the parks, and you know, Howard County and Columbia are kind of a weird one because there's so much green space, whether it's counted as parks or just green spaces might change the data. And from DNR perspective, we always talk about the right tree for the right place. I think having the right park and the right park amenities for the right place are also a big thing. And Jan's people powered versus nature powered and co-location of green space and parks is pretty important because, and I can't remember the name of the park, but you have a big multi-purpose field park in this, you know, heart of Columbia. And I know it's developing into more, but initially there wasn't really, if you were not involved in a sports team who was taking that field and scheduled team sports, then the park was not really made available to you. I think that's evolving and changing, but there's a lot of subtle discussions that can be had, and I'd love to talk to you more.
Thank you both. I'll definitely be reaching out as we figure out what we're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I actually, just as an aside, there was what does PD stand for? Professional development. There are some teachers who reached out to me about environmental justice and developing some PD, you know, resources. And I came up with some stuff for them, so I'd be happy to share that as well. So I've talked about community voices here, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, you know, how community voices impact the development of this tool. So this tool was built from kind of the infrastructure. Sandy had originally, you know, Sandy and her team had originally worked on the Park Equity Mapper, but we also, outside of that, have been working on this tool called the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening Tool, where we held numerous stakeholder meetings to really get at, okay, what are the indicators here? What are the, you know, what are the concerns for, and that was broadly talking about environmental justice. This and what are the concerns? So we had that kind of iterative back and forth process with community, which is not something that we did for this project, just because of the way that it was already up off the ground and we kind of just wanted to add to it. But we always knew we wanted to come back and get more develop some of the layers and then come back and do some ground truthing and testing. And so our first stab at doing that ground truthing and testing was to put out a survey and just ask folks, what is your relationship with parks? And if I can find my thing here, what is your relationship with parks, and how do you perceive your access to these parks? And so the first thing, and it didn't necessarily go as planned. This is a pilot effort, so sent to kind of a small group. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to test our network to see if we had what it took to roll out this survey in a way that would get the community, not just broadly community voices. We wanted to have sufficient sample size and significance in that. But we specifically were wondering, using our target networks and avenues, if we could hear from communities that were specifically in these areas where we noticed that there was low park equity and compare the two, right? And so that didn't really happen. We laid out the survey, and what came back was not just overwhelmingly responses from white park users, 65% you can see here on the screen. And then also I have to note that our response rate was very low, and a lot of this had to do with COVID. I will say a lot of this had to do with COVID and just how hard engagement in general has been over the last 18 months. So not only from an overwhelmingly kind of white participant response rate, but also, and these slides are a little bit out of order, but from higher income households, and I'll get to that slide in a second. But as we're here, age was kind of well represented from what we were expecting. People over the age of 35 made up a large percentage, 60, more than half of the distribution here. And then, it skewed very highly towards those who are college educated. And this also kind of goes out to, we couldn't do the in-person hitting the ground, going, to community events to display paper surveys or take the iPads out. We were mostly working with just disseminating this in spaces online. So highly skewed towards college educated folks. And then when we're talking about income, 53% of respondents reported making more than $50,000 per year, and in some cases, up to 20% here making more than $100,000 a year. So trending towards upper middle class, middle class and richer. Not a whole lot of responses on the lower end of the income spectrum. So I'll present all this to I'll give the findings, but I want you to know who those findings apply to and who they don't apply to necessarily. And so we got a lot of responses from Montgomery County, from PG County, Baltimore County, Baltimore City. Are not a lot of penetration in our rural counties in the state, of which there are many here on both the eastern shore and the western side of the state. And then we got a lot of responses from folks who had lived in their counties or in their areas for more than 10 years, which is really good because it tells us that it tells us that maybe they're more familiar with the parks in their area. But also for folks that might be more transient, it doesn't really give us kind of their take on their access to park equity there. And so now let's get into some of the questions that we asked. We asked questions about what types of green spaces people are exposed to, and then the types of amenities at those spaces. So the types of green spaces: wooded lots, school grounds, wildlife refuges, neighborhood parks, pocket parks, tiny parks, and then street trees, hiking trails, picnic areas, athletic fields, fishing and boating areas. And we asked them things like, how long does it take you to get to a park? For this case, for school grounds, most folks said less than 15-minute walk, as opposed to less than a 5-minute walk, or less than a 30-minute drive, or more than a 30-minute drive. Okay. And I won't go kind of for each of these green spaces. I won't go through all of the things, because I think what are we at? We've got I got 6 minutes before I got to turn it in, or actually no, I got 6 minutes before I have to end it totally. But then, then we looked at it and we took a look at it from the point of race. And again, I have to give the caveat that we didn't have a full, 385 responses, which is what we were shooting for an adequate sample size for the state. But of our participant pool, we found that largely, Asian Americans had the least commute to school grounds, followed by white respondents and multiracial respondents. 75% of Black and African American respondents and 50% of Latinx and Hispanic respondents reported that school grounds were less than a 15-minute walk away. And then we did the same thing for income. And so access to school grounds seemed equal across a lot of the different income levels, but notably 100% of the respondents falling within that lowest income bracket had about a 15-minute walk to a school grounds, okay? And so this speaks to places like Baltimore County, where you have those partnerships that Sandy was talking about, where you have those open access kind of partnerships where, even if you're not affiliated with the school, you can go and use that park and use that green space. One thing that I really want, so I have more results here, but one thing that I really want to get to, even beyond just kind of my summary here, is these other concerns regarding green spaces. So what we asked a question, what's your primary concern regarding access to green space? And by far, folks said it's too far away, okay? That's their primary concern. Followed though by other. And when we say other, what are some of those other concerns? Traffic is a barrier, especially when you're walking or cycling. Parks that charge entry, not having recycling or trash bins, access to restrooms, emergency situation, not proper signage to know what am I supposed to do in an emergency. Creating more than one entry point, again, kind of speaking to that emergency piece, lack of parking, playground equipment. So one thing that we weren't really expecting to get was all of these different nuances that we didn't initially build into our tool. We looked into kind of trying to get, okay, how can we get some facilities information from these parks? But we weren't able to get it easily. And so we kind of just left it off. But based on a lot of these responses, we're like, oh no, we need to look a little bit harder on how to get this data in here. So this is one of the major wins from this project, or from this pilot survey. And we're going to try and redo it. Hopefully COVID will be nice to us and help us out on the next go around. But this just goes to kind of state that these tools are not a substitute for community voice and community feedback. And what we hope to implement across all of our tools is a kind of online interaction portal, so folks can actually use the tool and then say, hey, this is how I rate your tool, and here's why. Here's what you got wrong, here's what you got right. So with that being said, I think that's our time. I think I can take one question, but as I said, I'm always here. Well, hopefully I'll be out of here in 2 years, but for now, for the next 2 years, I am at your disposal. Reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Any questions on Huva, Denise or Michaela? Okay, I will take that to mean I did a sufficiently decent job at this, and I will send all of you on to your next session. We've got a 10-minute break before the 2:20 block starts. For this room, that will be the promises and pitfalls of mapping. So I think, yes, that's what it's going to be. So stick around if you want to talk some more about mapping. I'll be joined by some really fantastic colleagues who are in this space. And if you don't want to talk about mapping, there are 3 other sessions going on during this next time block, and I can share those. Let's see, as we go into the last part of today. So there'll be a session on, I can share my screen here. Okay, so also in this last block, a rising threat, climate inequity in coastal communities, environmental justice highlights from the National Wildlife Federation, NWF, And then intersectional I wish I could be in this one. Do I have to stay and moderate this next panel? Intersectional environmental justice beyond the binary, gender, ecofeminism, and environmental health. If you do end up going over there, tell Faith I said hi. She's one of the other conference organizers for this event. So with that, I will close out this room for 10 minutes. Well, maybe I think one of our speakers for the next group is already here. So what I'll do is just kind of get things flipped and ready for the next one, but feel free to stay or feel free to go. Thank you, everyone. How do I stop recording? Stop sharing. Stop recording.